Here's a question worth sitting with before anything else in this video. What kind of government do you build after being controlled from the outside 5 separate times in a row? Because that's the actual question this story answers, and it has almost nothing to do with what most people assume when they hear the word Iran. Most people picture a regime, a hostage crisis, a set of protests, a country locked in permanent confrontation with the West. What almost nobody pictures is the 2 centuries that came before any of that. 2 centuries in which foreign empires treated Iran not as a country to be respected, but as a chessboard to be divided, taxed, and quietly controlled without ever needing to fully invade it. Fewer people still know that this same country was, for most of its long history, one of the dominant civilizations on Earth, ruling territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, long before anyone called it a chessboard at all. The regime governing Iran today wasn't built primarily out of religious doctrine, though religion plays a real role in it. It was built deliberately and specifically as an answer to that exact pattern of outside control repeated so many times across so many decades that by 1979, an entire nation was willing to tear down its own government rather than let it happen again. Understanding that 200-year pattern is the only way to actually understand why this particular government was designed the way it was, and why, decade after decade, it has proven so difficult for any outside power to remove. This is the story of how Iran got here, told strictly through the history that built it. To understand how this pattern started, you have to go back to the year 1800 to a kingdom ruled by a dynasty called the Qajars, sitting in one of the most strategically dangerous locations on the entire map. Iran, at the turn of the 19th century, sat directly between 2 expanding empires. To the north, the Russian Empire was pushing steadily southward, seeking year-round access to warm-water ports, since its own northern harbors froze for much of the year, a strategic ambition Russian planners had pursued for generations across multiple directions of expansion. To the west and south, the British Empire was watching that expansion with genuine alarm, because the territory just east of Iran functioned as the strategic approach to British India, the single most valuable possession in the entire British Empire. Losing influence over Iran, from London's perspective, risked handing Russia a direct path toward threatening India itself, a concern serious enough that one British general reportedly described Russia as, in his words, a disagreeable and even dangerous neighbor. This rivalry between the 2 empires played out across Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia throughout the 19th century came to be known as the Great Game, a decades-long contest for regional influence that shaped Iranian sovereignty long before oil ever entered the picture. Russia moved first and moved decisively, defeating Qajar Iran in a series of wars during the early 1800s and forcing a series of deeply unequal treaties in the aftermath. These treaties didn't just cede Iranian territory around the Caspian Sea to Russian control. They granted Russian merchants operating inside Iran exemption from Iranian law entirely, a form of extraterritorial legal privilege that placed foreign nationals functionally above the laws of the country hosting them. Iran was additionally required to pay Russia war reparations for having lost the conflict in the first place, compounding the humiliation of territorial loss with an ongoing financial burden extracted directly from the Iranian treasury for years afterward. Britain, watching Russia's gains with rising anxiety, adopted a specific and telling strategic posture. Rather than attempting to occupy Iran outright, which British officials recognized as impractical given the country's mountainous, difficult terrain and considerable size, Britain focused instead on preventing any rival power from controlling it, while extracting its own economic advantages through pressure rather than direct annexation. British officials were remarkably candid about this strategy at the time, stating plainly that they had no desire to occupy Iran themselves, only an unwillingness to see a rival power occupy it in their place. Britain fought several of its own wars with Iran during this same period, specifically to prevent Iranian territory to the east from falling under influence that could eventually threaten the approaches to India, treating the entire eastern frontier of Iran as ground that had to remain outside any rival empire's reach, regardless of what Iran's own government actually wanted for that same territory. This is the pattern worth naming clearly, because it recurs throughout this entire story. Neither empire needed to conquer Iran outright to control it. They simply needed enough leverage, economic, military, or diplomatic, to ensure Iran's decisions ultimately served their own strategic interests rather than Iran's own. The Qajar monarchs, chronically short of money to fund their own government, found a way to profit from this rivalry rather than simply suffer under it, at least in the short term. They began selling economic concessions, exclusive rights to operate specific industries inside Iran, to whichever empire offered the best terms, effectively monetizing pieces of their own country's economic sovereignty in exchange for immediate cash. In 1890, one Qajar Shah sold Britain a complete 50-year monopoly over Iran's tobacco industry, a business woven deeply into ordinary Iranian daily and social life, meaning every cigarette or pipe of tobacco consumed anywhere in the country would now flow through a British commercial intermediary. That single concession triggered something genuinely new in Iranian history: a nationwide boycott, coordinated across social classes and regions, and reportedly even extending into the royal household itself, forceful enough that the Shah was compelled to cancel the agreement entirely within months. It was a small but significant demonstration that collective Iranian resistance could actually reverse a decision made by the monarchy in cooperation with a foreign power, a lesson that would echo forward through every subsequent chapter of this story. That momentum built further over the following decade. In 1905 and 1906, a broad coalition of merchants, clergy, and intellectuals demanded a formal constitution, a limitation on royal power, and the creation of an elected parliament, making Iran home to one of the first constitutional revolutions anywhere in the Middle East, predating similar movements in several neighboring regions. The reigning Shah initially permitted this new parliament to form, granting Iran a written constitution and its first representative assembly. His successor did not share that tolerance, and neither did Russia, which viewed the new parliament's drive to reduce foreign economic privileges and oversight as a direct threat to its own accumulated interests inside the country. In 1908, Russian forces, invited in to support the Shah against his own parliament, shelled the parliament building directly with artillery, killing a substantial number of the elected lawmakers and revolutionary leaders inside it, arresting many of the survivors and executing others in the aftermath. It was, in the most literal sense, a foreign power helping an Iranian monarch kill Iran's own elected representatives, a precedent whose echo would return with even greater consequence decades later. Just as this rivalry over territory and legal privilege was reaching a new intensity, a discovery in 1908 permanently changed the stakes of controlling Iran, and it had nothing to do with buffer zones or warm water ports at all. A wealthy British investor, who had purchased oil exploration rights from the Qajar government in 1901, finally struck oil after 6 years of searching in southwestern Iran. This discovery arrived at almost exactly the moment the British Royal Navy was transitioning its fleet from coal power to oil power, a shift that would define naval and military dominance for the rest of the 20th century. Overnight, Iran's strategic value to Britain multiplied dramatically. It was no longer simply a buffer protecting the approaches to India. It now sat on top of the fuel source that would determine the outcome of future wars and the naval supremacy of whichever power controlled it. The company formed to extract and sell this oil would eventually become known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and later still, British Petroleum, a corporate name still recognizable today, directly descended from this 1908 Iranian oil discovery. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Iran formally declared neutrality, wanting no part in a European conflict it had no stake in. That declared neutrality made no practical difference. Iran's strategic location and its oil reserves made it too geopolitically significant for the warring powers to simply leave alone, and foreign troops moved through and occupied portions of Iranian territory throughout the war, regardless of the country's stated position. The war devastated Iran's economy, and historians estimate that roughly 2 million Iranians died from famine and disease directly connected to wartime disruption, a staggering toll for a country that had never chosen to participate in the conflict inflicting it. In the aftermath of the First World War, Russia underwent its own revolution, transforming into the Soviet Union and, at least temporarily, withdrawing much of its direct involvement in Iranian affairs. Britain, however, only deepened its presence, extracting Iranian oil at an accelerating pace throughout the 1920s. It was in this environment of exhaustion, foreign extraction, and a full century of accumulated national humiliation that a military commander named Reza Khan rose to power, working with Iran's parliament to remove the sitting Qajar monarch and establish himself as the new Shah, taking the name Reza Shah and founding the Pahlavi Dynasty in 1925. Reza Shah's program was explicitly nationalist, aimed directly at reversing the pattern of foreign humiliation that had defined the previous century. He emphasized pre-Islamic Persian identity and historical greatness, reminding the population that Iran had been a dominant civilization for over 2,000 years before it was ever reduced to a chessboard for competing empires, formally requested in 1935 that the country be referred to internationally as Iran rather than the Western term Persia, and pursued rapid top-down modernization. A trans-Iranian railway connecting the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, a new national university in Tehran, expanded infrastructure across roads and hospitals, and a strong centralized bureaucracy and secular legal system that deliberately reduced clerical authority over civil affairs, moving family law, education, and courts increasingly under direct state rather than religious control. In 1936, his government banned certain forms of women's head covering as part of a broader campaign to visibly westernize Iranian public life, a policy that, like much of his program, was imposed from above rather than emerging from broad popular consensus. These reforms were genuinely transformative in scope, and they were also implemented with considerable authoritarian force, with Reza Shah suppressing political opposition, censoring the press, and forcibly settling nomadic populations throughout his rule in the name of accelerating Iran's modernization and independence from foreign influence. That drive for independence, however, would soon collide directly with the same old pattern this story keeps returning to, arriving once again in the form of a global war fought largely by other people, on Iranian soil, for reasons that had little to do with Iran's own interests. It's worth pausing on just how quickly Iran's strategic value transformed once oil entered the picture, because it changed the entire character of outside interest in the country. Before 1908, Iran mattered to Britain primarily as a buffer, a piece of geography to be denied to a rival. After 1908, Iran mattered because of what sat beneath its own soil, a shift from denying access to actively extracting value, and that shift would prove far harder to walk back once the money involved grew large enough. By the 1920s, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company represented one of the largest single sources of profit in the entire British commercial empire, a scale of revenue that guaranteed London's continued active interest in Iranian internal affairs for decades to come, regardless of whichever government happened to be sitting in Tehran at any given moment. The British government itself became a majority shareholder in the company in 1914, meaning the profits flowing out of Iranian oil fields were, from that point forward, flowing directly into the British state's own treasury, not merely into a private corporation's accounts, a detail that made the stakes of any future dispute over Iranian oil a matter of direct concern to the British government itself, not simply a private commercial disagreement between a company and a foreign country. As part of his modernization program, Reza Shah had brought in German engineers and technical advisors to help build Iran's new infrastructure, a routine enough decision in the 1930s, when Germany was a leading industrial and engineering power respected across much of the world. By 1941, however, Germany was at war with both Britain and the Soviet Union, and the presence of German nationals inside Iran, regardless of their actual role, became, from London's and Moscow's perspective, an unacceptable strategic risk. Iran sat directly along a critical supply corridor the Soviets needed to receive Allied military equipment overland, and it remained a vital source of oil for the British war effort. Britain and the Soviet Union jointly demanded that Reza Shah expel the German nationals working in his country. Reza Shah, having spent his entire reign trying to reduce exactly this kind of foreign dictation over Iranian internal affairs, attempted to negotiate and delay rather than comply outright. The response, in August 1941, was direct military invasion. British and Soviet forces jointly invaded and occupied Iran from multiple directions simultaneously. Overwhelming the modernized army Reza Shah had spent nearly 2 decades building, forcing his abdication and sending him into exile, ultimately in South Africa, where he would die a few years later without ever returning to the country he had ruled. In his place, the occupying powers installed his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah, a considerably more pliable choice from the perspective of the two empires that had just removed his father by force. The pattern from more than a century earlier had simply repeated itself with modern armies. Iran's stated neutrality and its ruler's own preferences were overridden the moment outside powers judged the country's strategic position and resources too important to leave to its own government's discretion. Iran spent the remainder of the Second World War as an occupied logistics corridor and oil source for the Allied war effort, serving as a critical supply route through which American and British equipment reached Soviet forces fighting Germany on the Eastern Front, its own sovereignty subordinated once again to the strategic needs of larger powers fighting a war it had never chosen to enter. When the war ended, the new young Mohammad Reza Shah remained in power. But the underlying resentment building across Iranian society for well over a century, at this point spanning 4 full decades of an increasingly organized domestic movement for genuine self-determination, had not gone away. If anything, it had deepened. Britain, even as it was rapidly decolonizing other parts of its empire in the years immediately following the war, including its withdrawal from India itself in 1947, showed no comparable urgency about relinquishing its enormously profitable control over Iranian oil, continuing to extract Iranian petroleum, ship it through its global network, and return only a modest share of the resulting profit back to the country it came from. The new Shah, installed by foreign militaries rather than chosen by his own people or even by ordinary domestic succession, was widely perceived across Iranian society correctly as fundamentally Britain's man rather than Iran's. That perception and the specific grievance over who actually controlled Iran's oil wealth would soon converge around a single figure who seemed, for a brief and genuinely remarkable moment in the early 1950s, capable of finally breaking a pattern that had held for a century and a half. It's worth naming plainly just how many distinct forms this same pattern had already taken by this point in the story, because the variety itself is significant. Unequal treaties in the early 1800s, economic concessions sold piecemeal to whichever empire paid the most, a parliament shelled by foreign artillery in 1908, a world war fought partly on Iranian soil despite declared neutrality. And now, in 1941, an outright military invasion and forced abdication, followed by the installation of a young, foreign-selected monarch. Four distinct mechanisms, deployed across roughly 140 years, all producing the same underlying outcome: an Iranian government whose actual decisions ultimately answered to foreign capitals rather than to its own people. That repetition, more than any single episode within it, is what would eventually demand a response severe enough to break the cycle entirely. That figure was Mohammad Mossadegh, a lawyer and longtime nationalist politician who had spent decades arguing that Iran's resources belonged to Iran, not to the foreign companies extracting them under agreements struck generations earlier under considerably weaker Iranian governments. The immediate grievance was concrete and quantifiable. Under the existing arrangement, the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, formerly the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and the direct predecessor of BP, paid Iran roughly 16% of the profits generated from Iranian oil, keeping the overwhelming majority for the company and, by extension, the British government that held a substantial ownership stake in it. When Iran's parliament pushed for a more equal 50-50 profit-sharing arrangement, similar to deals other oil-producing nations were beginning to negotiate with foreign operators around the same period, Britain proved willing to offer somewhat improved terms, but not full parity, and certainly not full Iranian control over the industry itself. Mossadegh rejected partial concessions entirely, arguing that Iran's oil, extracted from Iranian soil, belonged fundamentally to the Iranian people and should be nationalized outright, brought under complete Iranian government control rather than negotiated as a percentage split with a foreign corporation. This position carried enormous popular support across Iranian society, resonating directly with a century and a half of accumulated resentment over foreign economic control, and Mossadegh himself became, almost overnight, one of the most popular political figures in modern Iranian history, celebrated as the man finally standing up to more than 100 years of foreign economic domination. In 1951, Iran's parliament formally voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and Mossadegh, riding the political momentum of that vote, was elected prime minister to implement it, a decision met with widespread public celebration across Iranian cities. Britain's response escalated rapidly. British officials attempted diplomatic pressure, then an international economic boycott specifically targeting Iranian oil exports, and eventually positioned Royal Navy vessels near the Strait of Hormuz specifically to discourage international shipping companies from transporting nationalized Iranian oil at all, hoping economic strangulation would force Mossadegh to reverse the nationalization. Mossadegh, backed by broad Iranian public support, refused to back down, framing the standoff explicitly as the culmination of Iran's century-long struggle to control its own resources and chart its own political course, free of foreign dictation. Unable to reverse the nationalization through economic pressure or diplomacy, British intelligence officials approached their American counterparts with a specific argument calibrated to the anxieties of the emerging Cold War: that Mossadegh's government, whether through his own sympathies or simply through the political chaos surrounding him, risked pushing Iran towards Soviet influence, potentially handing Moscow access to Iranian oil that the West could not accept under any circumstances. The newly inaugurated Eisenhower administration, deeply concerned with containing Soviet influence anywhere on the globe, found this argument persuasive enough to act on. In 1953, the American Central Intelligence Agency, working jointly with British intelligence, launched a covert operation funded with the equivalent of roughly $12 million in today's currency to remove Mossadegh from power. Operatives inside Iran bribed politicians, funded organized street demonstrations against Mossadegh, and paid newspapers to publish coordinated attacks on his government. An initial attempt to simply dismiss Mossadegh through the Shah's royal authority failed outright, forcing the young Shah himself to briefly flee the country. The covert operation regrouped, successfully turning key elements of Iran's military against Mossadegh's government. Mossadegh was arrested, tried by military tribunal for failing to comply with the Shah's dismissal order, and sentenced to house arrest, where he would remain, largely isolated from public life, until his death years later. The Shah returned from his brief exile and resumed full control of the country, now understood by virtually everyone inside Iran to be beholden not just to Britain, but to the United States as well, the power that had just demonstrated its willingness and capability to reverse an elected Iranian government's core policy by force. It's worth being precise about why 1953 looms so much larger in Iranian national memory than any single prior episode in this story, even though it wasn't the first time a foreign power had removed an Iranian leader. It was the first time it had happened through a covert intelligence operation, rather than an outright military invasion or a treaty signed under open duress, meaning the mechanism of control had become quieter, more deniable, and in some ways more insidious than anything that had come before it. For decades, the American role in the operation remained only partially acknowledged in public, even as it was widely understood and discussed inside Iran itself. When declassified documents and official acknowledgments eventually confirmed the CIA's central role in planning and executing the coup, it simply confirmed what generations of Iranians had already concluded from lived experience, that even a democratically elected government, one that had followed every constitutional procedure available to it, could still be erased entirely the moment it threatened a foreign power's economic interests. The Shah, who returned to power in 1953, pursued a program that, in its broad strokes, echoed his father's decades earlier. Rapid modernization, expanded women's rights, including the right to vote, land reform, and significant investment in education and infrastructure, all pursued with considerable authoritarian force and an increasingly visible reliance on American backing. To maintain control amid growing domestic opposition, the Shah's government, with direct assistance from the American CIA, established and trained a secret police and intelligence organization known as SAVAK in 1957, tasked with surveilling, arresting, and in many documented cases, torturing political dissidents across Iranian society, becoming one of the most feared institutions in the country over the following 2 decades. The Shah additionally extended legal immunity to American military personnel and advisors stationed in Iran through a 1964 agreement, a diplomatic arrangement that, to many ordinary Iranians, echoed the exact extraterritorial privileges Russia had extracted from Iran over a century earlier, reinforcing the sense that foreign powers still operated above Iranian law inside Iran's own borders. That specific 1964 agreement, granting American personnel immunity from Iranian courts, provoked one of Khomeini's earliest and most pointed public denunciations of the Shah's government, drawing an explicit line between this new arrangement and the same pattern of humiliating legal privilege Iran had been forced to grant foreign powers since the early 19th century. Oil revenue during this period funded genuine economic development, but it also funded increasingly visible royal extravagance, including opulent palace celebrations that drew international criticism, even as much of the country's rural population remained in poverty, while a growing and increasingly educated Iranian population watched a government widely perceived as a Western client state repress domestic dissent with imported tools and imported legal protections. The Shah also became, over this period, the single largest purchaser of American military equipment anywhere in the world, building one of the most heavily armed conventional militaries in the entire Middle East, a buildup funded almost entirely by oil revenue and justified as protecting Iran's regional position, even as many ordinary Iranians saw it primarily as arming a government that answered to Washington. One of the Shah's most vocal critics during this period was a Shia religious scholar named Ruhollah Khomeini, who framed his opposition not merely as a religious objection to specific policies, but as a direct continuation of Iran's century-and-a-half-long struggle against foreign domination, explicitly naming British, Soviet, and American interference as the recurring source of Iran's suffering across generations, describing the country's political leadership in speeches as having sold Iran's independence and reduced its people to subjects of foreign will. Khomeini was arrested following a wave of protests in the mid-1960s, and Iranian authorities, wary that executing him might further inflame an already volatile public mood, instead forced him into exile, first in Turkey, then in Iraq, and eventually in France, from which he continued distributing recorded sermons smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes, reaching mosques and villages across the country throughout the 1970s, and slowly building a movement that fused religious authority with the same anti-imperial grievance that had animated Iranian protest movements since the Tobacco Boycott nearly a century earlier. By the second half of the 1970s, opposition to the Shah had broadened well beyond religious circles to include merchants, students, intellectuals, and industrial workers, a coalition that, much like the tobacco protests of 1890 and the constitutional movement of 1905, transcended any single ideological faction and instead united around a single shared grievance: the perception that Iran's own government remained fundamentally a foreign-backed arrangement rather than a genuine expression of Iranian self-governance. Mass protests through 1978 were met with martial law and live gunfire from Iranian security forces, followed by a crippling strike among Iran's oil workers that struck directly at the government's primary source of revenue. In January 1979, the Shah left the country, publicly describing the departure as a temporary vacation, though he would never return. Weeks later, Khomeini flew back to Tehran to crowds numbering in the millions, moved quickly to secure the loyalty of key military units, and began dismantling the monarchy, the existing parliament, and the entire governing apparatus that had defined Iran for the better part of 2 centuries of foreign entanglement. What makes this moment genuinely remarkable and worth sitting with before moving on is how it actually happened. This wasn't a foreign-orchestrated regime change of the kind that had repeatedly defined Iran's political history up to this point. It wasn't a war, and it wasn't a covert operation run out of a foreign embassy. It was, by most credible historical accounts, the largest popular uprising the country had ever produced, a coalition spanning shopkeepers, students, oil workers, and religious leaders, united less by a shared vision of Iran's future than by an exhausted, shared refusal to tolerate outside control any longer. For the first time in nearly 200 years, an Iranian government fell, not because a foreign power decided it should, but because Iran's own population decided it would. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually trace how 2 centuries of accumulated history produced the specific government structure standing today. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because this is the moment the entire story has been building toward. What did Khomeini and Iran's revolutionaries actually build once the old order was gone? The system that emerged wasn't designed as a conventional democracy, and it wasn't designed as a simple religious theocracy either, at least not in the way that framing is sometimes casually used. It was designed, quite specifically and quite deliberately, as an answer to the exact historical pattern this video has just traced. A structure engineered from the ground up to resist the specific mechanisms, economic concessions, foreign-backed coups, and pliable puppet monarchs that had repeatedly allowed outside powers to control Iran for nearly 2 centuries without ever needing to fully occupy it. At the top of this new system sits a position called the Supreme Leader, occupied first by Khomeini himself, and since his death in 1989 by his successor, granted extensive constitutional authority over the military, the judiciary, state media, and the appointment of numerous other senior officials throughout the government. Beneath that position, the new constitution did preserve genuinely democratic elements. An elected parliament, an elected president, and even a specially elected body of experts empowered to appoint or remove the supreme leader himself. But every one of those elected positions operates within a tightly controlled boundary, because unelected religious councils, themselves appointed by the supreme leader, retain the authority to determine which candidates are even permitted to appear on any given ballot in the first place. A structure political scientists often describe as a filtered democracy, genuine elections operating entirely within limits set by unelected religious authority. This layered design reflects a lesson drawn directly from 1953. A single elected office, however popular, can be captured or removed if enough pressure is applied at just one point in the system, so the post-revolutionary constitution deliberately avoided concentrating ultimate authority in any single elected position the way the office of prime minister once was. Layered on top of these formal institutions is a distinct security architecture built specifically around regime survival rather than conventional national defense. Alongside Iran's regular military, which defends the country's borders in the ordinary sense, the government maintains an entirely separate force called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, complete with its own ground forces, air power, and navy, whose core mission is protecting the regime and its revolutionary principles specifically, distinct from protecting Iranian territory in the conventional military sense. Beneath that sits a vast volunteer militia network embedded at the neighborhood and village level across the entire country, extending the government's presence and surveillance capacity down to the most local possible level of everyday life. Taken together, Iran now maintains well over 500,000 active military personnel, and considerably more once affiliated militia networks are included, a security apparatus explicitly structured in overlapping, redundant layers so that no single coup, no single assassination, and no single foreign-backed uprising could plausibly seize control of the entire system at once, the way a single set of bribed generals had managed to do in 1953. Every one of these design choices maps directly onto a specific historical wound this video has already traced. A filtered democracy exists because an elected prime minister, Mossadegh, was removed the moment his policies threatened outside interests. A parallel, ideologically loyal military exists alongside the conventional armed forces because it was the conventional military's shifting loyalty, engineered through bribery and pressure, that made both the 1908 parliamentary crackdown and the 1953 coup possible in the first place. A neighborhood-level militia network exists because centralized control alone had repeatedly proven vulnerable to a small number of foreign-funded operatives working through elite institutions in the capital. This is not a system that emerged from abstract theology. It is a system that emerged from a detailed, generational autopsy of exactly how Iranian governments had previously fallen, with a specific structural countermeasure engineered against each individual failure point. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually trace how 2 centuries of accumulated history produced the specific government structure standing today. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because this is the moment the entire story has been building toward. What did Khomeini and Iran's revolutionaries actually build once the old order was gone? The system that emerged wasn't designed as a conventional democracy, and it wasn't designed as a simple religious theocracy either. at least not in the way that framing is sometimes casually used. It was designed, quite specifically and quite deliberately, as an answer to the exact historical pattern this video has just traced. A structure engineered from the ground up to resist the specific mechanisms, economic concessions, foreign-backed coups, and pliable puppet monarchs that had repeatedly allowed outside powers to control Iran for nearly 2 centuries without ever needing to fully occupy it. At the top of this new system sits a position called the Supreme Leader, occupied first by Khomeini himself, and since his death in 1989, by his successor, granted extensive constitutional authority over the military, the judiciary, state media, and the appointment of numerous other senior officials throughout the government. Beneath that position, the new constitution did preserve genuinely democratic elements. An elected parliament, an elected president, and even a specially elected body of experts empowered to appoint or remove the supreme leader himself. But every one of those elected positions operates within a tightly controlled boundary, because unelected religious councils, themselves appointed by the supreme leader, retain the authority to determine which candidates are even permitted to appear on any given ballot in the first place. A structure political scientists often describe as a filtered democracy, genuine elections operating entirely within limits set by unelected religious authority. This layered design reflects a lesson drawn directly from 1953. A single elected office, however popular, can be captured or removed if enough pressure is applied at just one point in the system, so the post-revolutionary constitution deliberately avoided concentrating ultimate authority in any single elected position the way the office of Prime Minister once was. Layered on top of these formal institutions is a distinct security architecture built specifically around regime survival rather than conventional national defense. Alongside Iran's regular military, which defends the country's borders in the ordinary sense, the government maintains an entirely separate force called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, complete with its own ground forces, air power, and navy, whose core mission is protecting the regime and its revolutionary principles specifically, distinct from protecting Iranian territory in the conventional military sense. Beneath that sits a vast volunteer militia network embedded at the neighborhood and village level across the entire country, extending the government's presence and surveillance capacity down to the most local possible level of everyday life. Taken together, Iran now maintains well over 500,000 active military personnel, and considerably more once affiliated militia networks are included, a security apparatus explicitly structured in overlapping, redundant layers so that no single coup, no single assassination, and no single foreign-backed uprising could plausibly seize control of the entire system at once, the way a single set of bribed generals had managed to do in 1953. Every one of these design choices maps directly onto a specific historical wound this video has already traced. A filtered democracy exists because an elected prime minister, Mossadegh, was removed the moment his policies threatened outside interests. A parallel, ideologically loyal military exists alongside the conventional armed forces because it was the conventional military's shifting loyalty, engineered through bribery and pressure, that made both the 1908 parliamentary crackdown and the 1953 coup possible in the first place. A neighborhood-level militia network exists because centralized control alone had repeatedly proven vulnerable to a small number of foreign-funded operatives working through elite institutions in the capital. This is not a system that emerged from abstract theology. It is a system that emerged from a detailed, generational autopsy of exactly how Iranian governments had previously fallen, with a specific structural countermeasure engineered against each individual failure point.